If you've ever kept something just for now, only to find it still sitting in your house 10 years later, then congratulations. You already understand the Middle Ages. Because the medieval world was full of things that were supposed to be temporary. Quick fixes, patch jobs, emergency solutions, ideas people made on the fly. And yet, somehow, many of those things stuck around for ages. Some of them even shaped the world we live in today. Tonight, we're going to walk slowly and calmly through that strange part of medieval life. The things that were never meant to last, but somehow survived for centuries. So settle in. Get comfortable. Maybe tuck yourself in if you haven't already. We're going way back, into a world where plans rarely lasted, but the results somehow did. Let's set the scene. Imagine a small medieval village. The kind where the houses lean a little to one side because nobody knew what straight lines were. Chickens walk around like they own the place. Someone's goat is standing on someone else's roof. And a man is repairing a wooden bucket for the fourth time this week because he refuses to buy a new one. The medieval world was simple, but it also moved slowly. Not because people were lazy, far from it, they worked from sunrise to sunset, but because most people didn't have the money or the time or the tools to build things that would last forever. Everything was done by hand. Everything was done with what was available, and almost everything was meant to last just for now. Need a home for winter? Build a quick hut. Need a road? Have people walk over the same patch of dirt until it becomes one. Need a rule? The king just shouts it once and hopes people remember. No one expected these things to stick around. And yet, many of them did. In fact, that's one of the funny things about history. The grand plans, the big ideas, the huge projects, sometimes those vanish. But the quick, simple, temporary solutions, those sometimes last longer than anything else. When we think of medieval times, we often imagine kings, castles, shining armor, and long feasts full of roasted animals that modern stomachs probably couldn't handle. But that wasn't the everyday world most people lived in. The real medieval world was built on improvisation. People weren't trying to make things perfect, they were trying to make things work. And when something worked well enough, people kept it, even if it wasn't beautiful. Even if it wasn't smart, even if nobody remembered why it was made in the first place. And yes, that includes some traditions that survived for hundreds of years, purely because no one bothered to stop them. You'll learn about homes that were supposed to last a season and ended up sheltering entire families across generations. You'll hear about random tracks carved in the mud by cows that later became official trade roads. You'll learn about temporary city walls, emergency taxes that never ended, and clothing styles that were basically medieval versions of, "I'll wear this until it falls apart." Some of these things shaped modern towns. Some shaped languages. Some shaped governments. And some shaped the way we live today, without us even knowing where the habit came from. It's almost comforting, in a way, because it tells us something simple. History isn't always made by grand designs. Sometimes it's made by little things that just refuse to go away. Another thing worth knowing about medieval life is that time felt very different. Today we think of years as fast. Seasons come and go, trends change every few months. But in the Middle Ages, the world moved slowly. If you wanted to travel to the next town, that was a whole day gone. If you wanted to fix your roof, you needed 3 friends and a miracle. If your only candle went out at night, you just went to sleep early and hoped ghosts didn't visit. So when people made something temporary, they often meant, "We'll fix it properly when we have time." Spoiler, they never had time. Between farming, working, surviving, praying, raising kids, and trying not to get sick from water that looked like soup, time was a rare luxury. So the temporary became the normal, and the normal became tradition. and tradition became, well, history. One thing we often forget is that medieval people weren't thinking about us. They weren't trying to leave a legacy or create something timeless. They were simply trying to get through their day. When they added a wooden extension to a church just for the upcoming festival, they had no idea it would still be there 200 years later. When they held a one-time feast, they didn't expect their grandchildren and great-grandchildren to celebrate the same event every year. Many things we think of as cultural traditions today started as, hey, let's just do this for now. But people liked them. They were familiar. They were easy. And anything easy was welcome. Because medieval life was hard, and when people found something that worked, even a little, they kept it. When most people today think of medieval houses, they imagine tall stone cottages with straw on the roof, smoke drifting from a chimney, maybe a wooden door that creaks like it hasn't been oiled since the dawn of time. But the funny thing is, most medieval folks never planned to build anything that fancy, or permanent, or straight, or even very dry. Most medieval homes were supposed to be temporary, quick shelters, simple huts, a this will do for now kind of place. And yet, somehow, these little houses hung around for decades, some for entire lifetimes. It all started with wattle and daub, the medieval version of grab whatever is lying around and hope it works. First, people made a simple frame out of skinny wooden poles. Nothing grand, just sticks shoved into the ground. Then they wove thinner branches between those poles like a giant basket. After that, they smeared mud, straw, and sometimes even animal dung on the outside to seal the gaps. And just like that, you had yourself a house. A temporary house. A house that everyone knew was not going to last. Except it did. People would say, we'll build a stronger house later. And then winter came, and then spring planting, and then summer work, and then autumn harvest, and by the time they remembered they wanted a new house, 10 years had passed, and everyone had accepted that the wobbly, mud-covered hut was apparently here to stay. Another reason these houses lasted so long is because medieval people were experts at patching things. If a wall cracked, they just slapped more mud on it. If the roof sagged, they added more straw. If the door fell off, they leaned a plank against the frame and called it a day. You know that one friend who refuses to buy a new phone and keeps fixing the screen with tape? That was the entire Middle Ages. And yet, these houses had a certain charm. The kind of charm that comes from being handcrafted by people who weren't always sure what they were doing, but did it anyway. The walls weren't really straight, the floors weren't really flat, the windows were usually just holes with cloth over them, and the roof liked to leak whenever it felt dramatic. But it worked. Mostly. On good days. Picture a family living inside one of these huts. A tiny fire flickers in the center of the room, because chimneys hadn't been invented yet. The smoke hangs around like an uninvited guest, moving out through a hole in the roof whenever it feels like it. Chickens wander inside because there are no real doors to stop them. The floor is dirt, the walls are uneven, but the house is warm, cozy, and full of life. It wasn't meant to last forever. It wasn't even meant to last 5 years. But people treasured it, repaired it, and stayed in it as long as possible. And sometimes, the homes stayed long enough to outlive the people who built them. There are records of families living in the same wooden house for generations, each one patching it up again and again. When a son became a father, he didn't build a new house. He simply added a tiny extra room onto the old one, then a shed, then a little lean-to for animals, then a storage corner, and before they knew it, the temporary hut had grown into a lopsided, rambling wooden home with a personality of its own. If you walked through a medieval village, you could almost see the history in each house. One hut would lean left, another would bulge out on the side, another had its roof tied together with rope because the owners didn't want to replace the beams. And nobody minded, because houses weren't supposed to be perfect. They were supposed to be useful. Stone houses did exist, but they were rare and expensive. You needed skilled workers, heavy tools, and a lot of time. Most villagers couldn't dream of that, so their wooden homes became part of the rhythm of life. Homes grew with the family, they changed with the seasons,
They aged with the people who lived in them. And in a way, that gave them a kind of warmth that grander buildings never had. Even when the wood rotted, people didn't tear down the houses. They simply replaced a beam, or two, or all of them, and somehow they still called it the same house. It's actually kind of sweet when you think about it. Medieval houses were like old family pets. Even when their joints creaked and their bodies leaned to one side, people still loved them. One funny thing about these temporary houses is that some of them lasted so long that they ended up inspiring more permanent architecture. Builders looked at old wooden huts and thought, that worked better than expected. And soon, even newer homes followed the same simple layout: a main room for everything, a sleeping loft, a small cooking area, and a door that didn't close all the way. Some medieval towns today still have houses built over the same footprint as an old wattle and daub hut. The original mud walls are long gone, but the shape stayed, the location stayed, the idea stayed. Temporary things have a way of doing that. Another surprising part is how these homes blended into nature. Roofs were made of straw, walls were mud and sticks, floors were dirt. If a house collapsed and nobody rebuilt it, the whole thing returned to the earth in a matter of years. No waste, no trash, just a quiet goodbye. And maybe that's why temporary buildings lasted so long back then, because people respected what they made. They didn't throw things away. They fixed them again and again, until fixing them became a tradition in itself. By the time you reached old age in the Middle Ages, your house wasn't just a building. It held your memories, your repairs, your mistakes, your laughter, your hard winters and long summers. Every piece of it had been touched by your hands, or your parents' hands, or maybe even your grandparents' hands. And for something that once started as a quick shelter made of sticks and mud, that's a beautiful kind of survival.
If you've ever walked somewhere so many times that a little path forms in the grass, then congratulations, you've just recreated medieval road engineering. Because most medieval roads didn't start as roads. They didn't start as planned routes, or carefully drawn maps, or big projects ordered by kings. Nope, they started as dirt, just dirt. Dirt that people, animals, carts, and life kept moving over until the ground finally gave up and said, "Sign, I guess I'm a road now." That's really how it happened. The earliest medieval roads weren't designed, they were discovered. A farmer walked to the fields every morning. A shepherd led her sheep to the hills. A merchant pulled a cart from one village to the next. A monk traveled to a nearby church. And little by little, the grass wore down, the soil packed flat, and a line appeared across the landscape. Nobody said, "Let's make a road here." People just walked and walked and walked, and the road quietly formed under their feet. Medieval people didn't expect these paths to last forever. In fact, they didn't expect them to last the season. A hard rain could erase the marks. A herd of animals could trample everything into a mess. Mud, snow, and storms were always ready to ruin their day. But the funny thing is, the same people walked again the next day, and the next, and the next, and somehow the path always came back. Before long, these dirt trails connected villages, then towns, then entire regions, and without ever planning to, people built a network of roads that would last centuries. Picture one of these medieval roads. It's narrow, it curves around trees, rocks, rivers, or anything too annoying to move. The surface is just packed earth, sometimes with ruts so deep you could lose a shoe in them. In winter, the whole thing turns into a slippery mud river. In summer, dust rises with every step, making travelers look like they've just walked through a flower factory. And yet, it worked. Mostly. Peasants used these dirt roads to reach markets. Soldiers used them to march to war. Traders used them to carry grain, wool, wine, spices, and anything else people were willing to buy. And pilgrims, the original medieval tourists, walked along these paths hoping to find blessings, miracles, or at least a warm meal somewhere along the way. These roads became the arteries of medieval life, and no one really meant for that to happen.
What makes it even funnier is that kings and lords often pretended they built these roads. They'd claim this is the royal highway, even though the highway was just a path peasants had been using long before the king knew it existed. Royal officials would place a sign or charge a toll or make rules about it. But the truth is, they didn't plan it. They just claimed it, like finding a random stick in the yard and saying, "Yes, this is mine now." But the real magic of medieval roads wasn't just how they were formed, it was how they survived. Even after the paths wore down, even after villages changed, even after kingdoms rose and fell, many of those old dirt roads stayed exactly where they were. People stuck to familiar routes. Travelers told others which way to go. Farmers passed down directions to their children. Take the old track by the big oak tree. Follow the ruts west. Stay left of the stream. And that oral memory kept the roads alive. Some of these paths eventually became so important that towns were literally built around them. A road might pass through a quiet patch of land, and slowly a shop opened, then a tavern, then a house, and before long a whole settlement formed, all because the road happened to be there. It's strange to think about how the entire shape of modern Europe grew from little dirt paths made by farmers who just wanted to get somewhere without stepping on too many thorns. But that's how it happened. As time passed, medieval roads developed personalities. Some were famous for being muddy every single day of the year. Others were known for bandits hiding behind bushes. Some were so narrow that two carts couldn't pass each other, and someone had to back up all the way to the previous village, and everyone hated the person who refused to move their cart first. Travelers developed tricks, like walking along the raised edges of the road to avoid sinking ankle-deep in mud, or carrying an extra pair of shoes because the ones they were wearing would get swallowed by a puddle, or tying their belongings tightly so bandits wouldn't snatch them. These roads weren't glamorous, they weren't smooth, they weren't even polite, but they stayed, year after year, century after century. And eventually, people stopped calling them paths or tracks and started calling them roads. Some towns paved them with stones, others simply kept patching the worst holes with wood or gravel. But the path underneath, the one carved by thousands of footsteps, remained the same. What's even more surprising is that many modern roads today follow the same routes. Highways, lanes, even borders grew out of those original medieval dirt paths. A million steps made by people long gone became the invisible foundation of the world we move through now. All from something temporary, all from dirt. The roads also played a quiet role in connecting medieval society. They carried news, gossip, rumors, stories. If someone in one village found a weird-looking vegetable, you could bet that within a week, people 2 towns away were talking about it. Roads moved not just goods, but ideas. Languages blended, cultures mixed, traditions spread, and none of that was planned. It was just the natural result of everyone walking the same dusty tracks. Next time you drive down a long country road, imagine it as a medieval dirt path. Picture villagers walking it with baskets, merchants pushing carts bouncing over ruts, children chasing chickens, travelers trying to guess which direction was least muddy. Think of the footsteps layered across centuries, all those people walking just for now, creating something no one expected to survive.
If you've ever stacked a few boxes by your door because you didn't feel like fully unpacking, only to realize those temporary boxes have now become part of your home decor, then you already understand medieval town planning. Because some of the biggest medieval cities we know today were shaped by walls that were never meant to stick around. Walls that started as quick defenses, emergency barriers, or wooden fences thrown up in a hurry, and somehow ended up becoming the permanent borders of entire cities. Let's go back to a medieval town during a tense moment. Maybe rumors are spreading about raiders or enemy soldiers. Maybe a rival lord is feeling dramatic again. Or maybe someone in town said something rude about the wrong prince. Whatever the reason, panic rises, and the town decides it needs protection, fast. A messenger rings a bell, a few people shout orders, and just like that, everyone starts building a temporary defensive wall. But don't picture tall stone towers or fancy battlements just yet. That kind of thing took money, stone, architects, and years of work.
What medieval towns wanted was speed. So most early walls were, well, not very impressive. Builders grabbed wooden logs, tree trunks, sharpened stakes, anything they could find that was straightish and sort of strong. They hammered them into the ground, side by side, to make a palisade. It didn't look elegant, it didn't look intimidating. In fact, if you squinted, it looked like a bunch of fence posts having a midlife crisis. But in the moment, it worked. It slowed down attackers. It made people feel safer. And most importantly, it was quick. These temporary walls had one job: survive long enough for the danger to pass. Nobody expected them to last for generations. People figured they'd tear them down later and build something nicer. But medieval life had a funny way of making later turn into never. Once the wall was up, people got used to it. The wooden fence became part of the daily scenery. Children played near it, farmers leaned tools against it, merchants set up stalls along its edges. And whenever a threat returned, or even if someone just thought a threat might return, the town was grateful the wall was still standing. Piece by piece, the temporary fence became a long-term habit. And then something even stranger happened. The wall began shaping the town. Imagine a merchant looking for a place to open a shop. They'd choose a spot just inside the wall, because that's where the traffic was. Someone building a home? Also inside the wall, because outside felt unsafe. Over time, buildings started filling the interior space like water filling a bowl. Meanwhile, as more people arrived, the town needed space, but not outside the wall. So instead of growing outward, many towns grew inward, upward, or squeezed sideways until the streets became so narrow that two goats passing each other needed to negotiate. And all because of a temporary fence. As years passed and new threats came and went, towns improved their walls. First, they fixed broken logs. Then they replaced sections. Then they rebuilt whole parts. A wooden section might be swapped for a stone one. A ditch might be dug around it. A simple lookout platform might turn into a small watchtower. But here's the funny part. Even when they upgraded the material, the shape of the wall stayed mostly the same. The temporary layout had become permanent. Some cities even built huge stone walls along the exact footprint of the original wooden palisade, the same shape someone had drawn in the dirt during a panic decades earlier. That shape then controlled where houses were built, where gates were placed, even where markets were allowed. It's almost adorable, really. One quick patch job ended up deciding the future of whole regions. And not only did towns grow around these walls, they depended on them. Walls became symbols of safety. Passing through a gate meant entering a protected world. Inside the walls, merchants traded, festivals happened, families lived, and rulers collected taxes from anyone who dared breathe while carrying goods. Outside the walls? Well, outside was basically good luck. Travelers approaching a town would see the walls from far away, standing tall on the horizon, even though the original version had been nothing more than rough wooden stakes. Over time, new walls were added, but the basic outline still matched the old temporary fence. Some towns even kept the same gate locations for centuries. These gates controlled traffic, trade, and movement. They were points where news entered, where goods arrived, where people gathered. And all because someone once hammered a few wooden beams into the ground, just for now. What's even more amusing is how stubborn medieval people could be about wall layouts. If someone suggested moving a gate or expanding the boundary, they'd get looks like, "Why would we change it? It's always been like this." Meanwhile, the always in question was maybe 30 years. But in the Middle Ages, 30 years felt like forever, and so the layout stayed. Eventually, these walls influenced city laws. Living within the wall often meant having certain rights or protections. Being outside the wall could mean paying extra taxes, following different rules, or simply being more exposed to danger. The temporary line drawn by a rushed group of villagers became a legal border, a political border, a cultural border. And even when towns expanded and built new walls farther out, the original shape usually stayed as a historical ring. Sometimes it became a main street, sometimes a walkway, sometimes the old wall foundations were turned into gardens or markets. In many modern cities, if you look at a map, you'll see a circular or oddly shaped ring road, a leftover path that follows the exact outline of a medieval wall. That wall might be gone, but the shape remains, like a ghost, reminding everyone that a temporary barrier once decided where life happened. So, next time you visit an old European town and walk through a beautiful stone gate, try to picture the original version. Not majestic, not impressive, just a bunch of wooden stakes rushed into the earth by tired villagers who were hoping to avoid trouble. They thought it would stand for a season, maybe a few years, just long enough for things to calm down. But the wall stayed, and stayed, and eventually became the backbone of a city that would outlive its builders by hundreds of years. All from something temporary, all from something simple, all from a panic idea that turned into a permanent legacy.
If you've ever looked at medieval fashion and thought, wow, people really walked around like that, you're not alone. Most of the clothing trends from the Middle Ages were never supposed to stay. They were quick fixes, random experiments, or just strange ideas that surprisingly stuck around for centuries. And in a funny way, some of these temporary choices still shape what we wear today. So let's stretch out, get comfortable, and slip into the wardrobe of medieval Europe. Very slowly, because some of these clothes were not designed for fast movement. Let's start with the tunic, the most basic piece of medieval clothing. At first, it was simply an easy, no-stress piece of fabric. People weren't trying to make a fashion statement. They just wanted something to cover their bodies and stay warm. It was supposed to be basic, temporary, and very replaceable. But the tunic somehow became the blueprint for almost every shirt, dress, and sweater design that came after. Even now, half of our winter clothes are just fancy tunics pretending to be modern. Next up are pointy shoes, known back then as poulaines. The original idea was to add just a slightly pointed toe to look stylish. But medieval people don't do slightly. They took the idea and stretched those shoe tips so long you could trip over them. Some tips were so extreme that men had to tie them to their knees so they didn't drag on the ground. It was meant to be a short fashion craze, but the pointed shoe trend survived. Faded, returned, faded again, and keeps coming back even in modern fashion cycles. Whenever you see sharp heels or long dress shoes, thank the medieval people who didn't know when to stop. Then there's corsetry, which was born from a practical problem. Clothes weren't shaped to fit bodies. Early corsets weren't meant to create dramatic hourglass figures. They were just meant to hold clothes in place. But, like everything else, people turned it into a whole fashion language. By the later Middle Ages, corsets became a constant part of women's wardrobes. What started as a simple fastening tool became a symbol of style, status, and eventually pain. And yet, even today, corset-styled tops are still everywhere, from red carpets to streetwear. The temporary solution is now a long-term fashion guest who refuses to leave. Another amusing example is the hood or chaperon. Originally, the hood was just a quick way to keep your head warm. It was a simple piece of cloth, no drama. But medieval folks decided simple wasn't enough. They twisted it, folded it, wrapped it around their heads in all sorts of bizarre shapes. Eventually, the hood evolved into hats, caps, and even certain types of clergy headwear. Today, hoodies are basically the modern version of an ancient idea. A temporary winter accessory somehow became the universal symbol of comfort. Let's not forget belts. In the early Middle Ages, they were just there to keep your tunic from flying around when the wind got aggressive. But people liked decorating them, adding metalwork, leatherwork, and bright colors. Slowly, belts turned into badges of rank and personality. Kings had special belts, warriors had decorated belts, and everyday people wore simple ones. And now, we still wear belts for both function and fashion. Some things never change. One of the strangest survivors is the cloak. It's such a dramatic piece of clothing. When you picture a cloak now, you probably imagine wizards, vampires, or superheroes.
But in the Middle Ages, cloaks weren't dramatic at all. They were like blankets you could walk around in. They protected people from rain, mud, and cold nights. The plan was simple: quick warmth. But instead of disappearing when jackets were invented, the cloak stuck around in different forms: coats, capes, robes, and, of course, anything worn by someone who wants to look mysterious on purpose. We also have the girdle, or waist belt. It began as a practical strap for carrying tools or pouches, but suddenly it became a fashion item. People decorated them with jewels or embroidery, and today, modern belts, waist chains, and even bag straps can trace their roots back to this simple medieval item. Even the undergarments of the Middle Ages, like early versions of underwear, were not meant to be a permanent idea. They were made for comfort and hygiene, nothing more. But they ended up influencing modern designs that we still wear every day, which is a strange but funny reminder of how long-lasting temporary ideas can be. What makes medieval fashion so interesting is how accidental it all was. People weren't planning runway shows or trying to create timeless looks. They just wanted to fix small problems, stay warm, stay comfortable, or look slightly better than the neighbor next door. But those small decisions survived for centuries and shaped so much of what we wear today. Medieval fashion wasn't actually magical or glamorous in real life. Most of it was itchy, heavy, or inconvenient. But even then, the creativity of medieval people created trends that never fully disappeared. Fashion evolves, materials change, but some designs are just too good or too funny to let go. And so, what started as temporary solutions became the foundation of entire wardrobes. Medieval fashion might look strange to us now, but little pieces of it are still walking around today, hanging in closets or trending on social media. It's proof that sometimes the most lasting things come from ideas no one expected to last at all.
When we think of medieval grooming, most of us imagine people walking around with messy hair, muddy boots, and maybe a strong smell of, "I haven't bathed since last harvest." But the truth is a bit funnier and a lot more surprising. Many grooming habits from the Middle Ages were supposed to be quick fixes, cheap solutions, or temporary traditions, yet somehow they survived and became things we still use in our bathrooms today. So relax, stretch out, and get cozy, because tonight we're stepping into a medieval washroom, slowly because everything in there is made of wood. Let's start with soap. Medieval soap was nothing like the soft, colorful bars we have today. It was made from animal fat and ash, and honestly, it smelled like disappointment. People didn't love using it, and many expected the whole soap-making thing to fade away, but soap was too useful to disappear. Even though it was rough and scratchy, it worked. Over time, it changed, improved, and somehow turned into a permanent part of life. Now we have scented soaps, liquid soaps, foaming soaps, fancy soaps that look like desserts, all thanks to a very temporary medieval attempt. Then there's hair oiling, which was originally just a practical way to stop hair from turning into a wild, tangled forest. People used olive oil, animal fat, or plant oils simply to smooth their hair or to keep lice away. No one thought this routine would last more than a season or two. But here we are, centuries later, buying coconut oil, argan oil, and serums that cost more than medieval rent. What started as a simple grooming hack accidentally became a billion-dollar industry. Another example is combs. Combs were extremely important in the Middle Ages, but not because everyone was obsessed with looking cute. They were used to remove lice, basically medieval people's worst enemy. Comb makers carved them from bone or wood, and almost every person had one. The purpose was basic: survive the bugs. But combs stuck around not just for survival, but for styling. Eventually, they became fancy items with decorated handles. Today, we use combs for beauty, not battle, but the basic design is almost the same. Now let's talk about beards. Medieval men treated shaving like a seasonal decision. Shaving tools were not very friendly. Imagine scraping your face with something that looks like a tiny farming tool. So facial hair trends changed often. A beard could mean wisdom, laziness, strength, or just "my razor broke, please don't judge." But one temporary practice survived: trimming and shaping beards.
It began as a small attempt at neatness and turned into modern barber culture. Today, we have beard oils, beard balms, professional shaping, all rooted in medieval efforts to look less like a wild forest spirit. One of the funniest survivors is mouth freshening. Medieval people didn't have toothpaste like we do, so they chewed herbs, mint leaves, or special little spices to freshen their breath. It was meant to be a quick, temporary solution before meeting someone important. Now we have chewing gum, mints, sprays, and toothpaste in every flavor. The whole idea of fresh breath for social moments started as a small medieval trick and somehow never went away. Speaking of teeth, medieval people used tooth scrapers, early versions of toothbrushes. At the time, they were basic, small, and extremely temporary tools. People didn't think they'd become a daily habit, but the idea of cleaning your teeth caught on. The tools improved and slowly evolved into the toothbrushes we use today: electric, soft bristle, hard bristle, colorful, or the ones that judge you for not brushing long enough. Another important grooming habit was perfume. Medieval perfume wasn't used to smell fancy. It was used to fight terrible odors from streets, animals, and sometimes even people. Perfume was a shield. Nobody imagined it would become a symbol of luxury or romance. But the habit of wearing scents stayed, improved, and eventually turned into the massive perfume industry we have now. Even bathing routines started as temporary traditions. Many medieval people bathed less often than we do, but when they did, it was a small event: heating water, filling tubs, adding herbs. Nobody thought regular bathing would become a daily ritual. Fast forward to today, and most of us shower so often that medieval people would think we're doing magic water rituals. Let's not forget nail care. It began with simple trimming to avoid injury. Workers, soldiers, and farmers needed short nails so they wouldn't break or cause problems. It was never about beauty. But over time, nail care turned into grooming. Grooming turned into style, and today we have salons, nail polish, and entire trends based on something medieval folks did only to survive. Even deodorizing herbs were used as quick fixes, stuffing herbs under clothes or inside rooms to smell better. And now we have deodorants, body sprays, scented lotions, all following the basic idea. What makes all of this so fascinating is how normal daily habits can last longer than kingdoms. Medieval grooming wasn't about fashion or style, it was about dealing with problems. But those small habits transformed into modern routines we follow every day without even thinking.
If you've ever come up with a quick, lazy solution at home, like using a plate as a cutting board or stacking books to make a phone stand, congratulations, you would have fit perfectly in the Middle Ages. Most medieval household habits started as simple shortcuts, temporary fixes, things people did because they didn't have time, money, or better tools. And somehow, those tiny household tricks survived for hundreds of years and became normal. So get cozy, tuck in your blanket, and let's step into a medieval home. Carefully, because there's probably a chicken running around somewhere. Let's begin with candles. Medieval villagers didn't plan for candles to become long-term household essentials. They were just the easiest way to see after sunset. Most candles were made of tallow, basically hardened animal fat, and they smelled exactly how you think they would. But people needed light, so they used them anyway. Over time, candles turned into a symbol of comfort, calmness, and even romance. What started as a smoky, smelly, temporary lighting hack slowly became a permanent piece of home culture. Today, we buy candles for scent, decoration, mood, and sometimes for no reason at all. Medieval folks would be shocked to learn people willingly pay extra for candles that smelled like lavender forests instead of cow fat. Then we have brooms. Early medieval brooms were literally bundles of sticks tied together. People never imagined these twig bundles would eventually evolve into modern broom designs or become the universal image of witches during Halloween. Medieval families made brooms quickly, cheaply, and replaced them often. No one expected this simple cleaning tool to become a permanent household item for centuries. But here we are, sweeping floors the same basic way, just with fewer splinters. And let's talk about doormats. Back then,
mats were nothing fancy. People placed rough pieces of woven straw by the entrance just to wipe off mud. Remember, medieval Europe had lots of mud. Mud was basically the unofficial mayor. Those straw mats were purely temporary. Wear them out, throw them away, make new ones. But this habit turned into the welcome mats we all have today. Colorful, cute ones that say things like, "Come back with snacks." Another hilarious survivor is the pantry. Medieval people didn't create pantries because they wanted an organized kitchen. They created them because winters were brutal and food spoiled fast. A small cool room or storage corner was just a survival hack. But over the centuries, this little idea became a whole household standard. Now pantries are a big deal. People organize them, decorate them, even show them off online like trophies. A temporary medieval food nook turned into a modern lifestyle feature. Then there's the fireplace. In the Middle Ages, it was simply the least worst way to heat a home. Houses were cold, insulation didn't exist, and winters were long. Fireplaces were smoky, dangerous, and very inefficient. Nobody expected them to become iconic, but fireplaces ended up shaping entire home designs, turning into symbols of warmth and comfort. Now we even have fake fireplaces on TV screens. If medieval people saw that, they'd think we've completely lost our minds. Next is one of my favorites, wooden spoons. These were never meant to be a permanent household classic. Medieval people made them because wood was cheap, easy to carve, and everywhere. But the wooden spoon design was so simple and effective that it stuck around. Today, even with all our modern kitchen tools, stainless steel, silicone, plastic, the humble wooden spoon refuses to retire. It's like the wise old grandparent of cooking tools. Another temporary item that became a forever habit was the laundry line. Medieval folks hung their clothes outside simply because that was the only option. Sun plus wind equals dry clothes. It wasn't a tradition, it was survival. But the idea stuck around. Even today, in many places, people still hang clothes outside. The method hasn't changed much at all. The only difference is that now the clothes smell more like detergent instead of smoke from your neighbor's fire pit. One of the funniest survivors is storage chests. Medieval people used chests because they didn't have closets. They shoved everything inside: clothes, tools, valuables, random items they weren't ready to throw away. Basically, medieval chests were the ancestors of modern junk drawers. And just like that, the chest evolved into cabinets, wardrobes, and entire bedroom sets. A temporary wooden box turned into a whole furniture category. Let's not forget tablecloths. Believe it or not, tablecloths weren't used for decoration at first. They were meant to hide the fact that medieval tables were rough, uneven, and sometimes a bit gross. Cover it, and boom, instant, clean table. Over time, the covering habit became formal, then fancy, then traditional. Today, tablecloths appear at weddings, celebrations, and big dinners, all because medieval families didn't want their guests to see scratches and stains. Even the garden was originally a temporary idea. Medieval homes grew herbs for medicine and simple vegetables for survival. They didn't garden for beauty. That came later. But the habit of keeping a small home garden never faded. Today, people garden for fun, for food, for peace, and sometimes just to flex their tomatoes on social media. The amazing thing about medieval household hacks is that they were never meant to last. People weren't trying to build traditions or design lifestyles. They were just solving problems using whatever they had. But sometimes the simplest solutions become the longest-lasting ones.
Festivals in the Middle Ages were wild, chaotic, messy, loud, joyful, and sometimes very confusing. Most of them were meant to be quick seasonal moments, little bursts of celebration to break up long months of work, cold, and survival. Nobody thought these temporary events would last. They were just traditions for the moment, for the year, for the harvest. But somehow, many of those medieval celebrations slipped into the future and became permanent holidays we still enjoy today. So get comfy, settle in, and let's wander through a medieval festival. Carefully, because someone is always juggling fire.
Let's begin with harvest festivals. These celebrations were purely practical. After months of back-breaking work, villagers came together to give thanks for crops and pray for a good winter. No one imagined these gatherings would evolve into modern celebrations like Thanksgiving or autumn festivals. But the idea stuck for a simple reason. People love celebrating surviving another season. What was once just a local event with bread, dancing, and maybe a goat running around is now a full national holiday in several countries. Another surprising survivor is midsummer festivals. These events started as temporary celebrations marking the longest day of the year. People lit bonfires, sang songs, and danced through the night. The bonfires were meant to protect the village from bad luck, because in medieval logic, fire solved everything. Today, midsummer is still celebrated in many places, especially in Northern Europe. What was once just one big summer party is now a cultural moment that refuses to fade. Then there's the iconic Christmas season. It might feel ancient and permanent now, but medieval Christmas was originally a short winter festival, tied to both religion and survival. People feasted because food would spoil otherwise, and they lit candles because the nights were long and cold. Over time, the celebration grew bigger and bigger. Many of the traditions we think of as modern Christmas actually have medieval roots: caroling, feasting, decorations, and even the idea of gift-giving. A temporary end-of-year festival slowly turned into the biggest holiday of the year. Let's not forget Carnival, which appeared in medieval Europe as one chaotic burst of fun before the fasting season. It was basically the medieval version of eat everything now before we can't. People wore masks, danced in the streets, and turned normal rules upside down. It was supposed to be a one-time yearly release of stress, but Carnival became so popular that it's now global. From Venice masks to Brazil's massive parades, medieval people would be very proud of how dramatic it's become. Another example is May Day, the spring festival. Villagers decorated flowers, crowned May queens, and danced around tall poles. It was a quick celebration of nature waking up after winter. No one planned for it to stick around forever. But spring celebrations are emotional. After months of cold, people want to celebrate warmth. And so, May Day survived centuries and is still celebrated in many countries. One of the quirkiest survivors is Saints' Days. Medieval Europe had a saint for almost every job: animal, illness, and random life situation. Saints' Days festivals were temporary events honoring whichever saint protected the village. But some of those celebrations never disappeared. Today, many regions still celebrate the same saints with parades, dances, and feasts. Medieval spiritual events quietly grew into cultural traditions. Now let's talk about weddings. Medieval weddings were not big fairy tale events. They were practical agreements between families. The feast afterward was just meant to be a temporary celebration of joining households. But some of the traditions, rings, feasts, dancing, and even wedding vows survived all the way into modern wedding culture. What started as a simple village party became one of the most important ceremonies in modern life. Another unexpected survivor is New Year celebrations. Medieval Europe didn't always agree on when the year actually started. Some celebrated in spring, others in March, and some in January. The festival itself was just a temporary moment to mark a new beginning, but the idea was too powerful to fade. Today, we celebrate New Year with fireworks, parties, countdowns, and resolutions, all faintly echoing medieval traditions of welcoming change with noise and excitement. Then we have market fairs. Medieval fairs were temporary pop-up events long before pop-up markets became trendy. Merchants traveled from town to town, and villages turned into busy hubs for a few days. Music, food, trade, and entertainment all mixed together. Nobody thought these temporary fairs would survive centuries, but they evolved into modern markets, seasonal fairs, county fairs, and even music festivals. Another big one is religious processions. These were meant to be temporary acts of devotion, walking through town, singing hymns, carrying icons, but the emotional impact kept them alive. Even now, festivals around the world still feature medieval-style processions, complete with music, candles, and crowds. Harvest dances, village games, fire rituals, seasonal storytelling, many of these were never meant to last. They were moments of joy carved out of hard medieval life. But humans need reasons to celebrate, and so temporary medieval festivals grew into lasting traditions. The amazing part is how familiar these celebrations feel. Bonfires, parades, feasts, and dancing. We do all of these things today for holidays. The decorations may look different, and the music may have changed, but the heart of the celebration is the same. People gathering, people relaxing, people celebrating life.
Taxes. Just hearing the word can make anyone sigh, and medieval peasants probably had the same reaction, though with more mud on their boots and fewer comfort foods. What's funny is that many taxes in the Middle Ages were never meant to be permanent. They were supposed to cover a short-term need, a war, a bridge repair, or a king's sudden craving for a fancy feast. But somehow, these temporary taxes survived for centuries, shaping governments, economies, and even the way we pay taxes today. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's slowly explore the surprisingly sticky world of medieval levies. Imagine a village where the lord suddenly needs money. Maybe there's an army to feed, a castle wall to repair, or a royal wedding to finance. Instead of raising funds over years, the lord announces a temporary tax. A few coins from every household, a basket of grain, a chicken or two. Everyone grumbles, gives what they can, and thinks, well, that's just for now. But here's where it gets tricky. Sometimes the danger didn't disappear. The war lasted longer than expected. The bridge needed constant repairs, or the royal wedding turned into a yearly celebration with more expenses than anyone could imagine. And guess what? The tax stayed. People grumbled more. Some tried to avoid it, but over time, everyone just got used to paying it. Temporary turned permanent. Take the scutage, for example. Originally, knights were supposed to serve in the army, but when they couldn't, they paid a fee instead. The king thought, this is just a one-time payment to replace soldiers. Centuries later, similar systems persisted, shaping how governments collect money in ways that still influence modern taxation. The temporary pay-instead-of-fight idea became a long-term fixture. Then there's the bridge toll. Villagers had to pay a small coin to cross a new bridge, supposedly temporary. But once the bridge was built and people started using it daily, the toll became permanent. Some bridges in Europe still have tolls today, tracing back to medieval decisions made in a hurry. The same principle applies to road taxes and market fees, temporary fixes that grew roots deep in the system. Another sticky tax was the hearth tax. This was meant to be a short-term contribution for local projects, calculated by the number of hearths or fireplaces in a home. People thought it would last a year or two. But just like the wooden houses and dirt roads we've talked about, the habit of counting homes for taxes became a long-term way for governments to understand populations and wealth. Temporary necessity evolved into bureaucracy. What makes medieval taxes fascinating is how flexible and adaptable they were. Authorities introduced them for emergencies, yet communities tolerated them for years. Why? Mostly because it was easier to keep paying a known tax than to argue about changing it. And also because new rulers inherited the same system and old taxes just quietly continued. If it ain't broken, keep collecting it. Seems to have been the unofficial motto. Some taxes were surprisingly creative. There was the window tax, where homeowners paid according to the number of windows in their house. Originally intended to fund short-term projects, it led to long-term architectural changes, fewer windows, bricked-up openings, and dark houses. What started as a temporary revenue scheme changed the look of cities for centuries. Then we have market taxes, meant to be temporary contributions during special trade events. Merchants paid a small fee for stalls, supposedly only for the season,
But over decades, these became regular charges, influencing the rise of trade regulations, market rules, and even town councils. Temporary solutions to fund festivals turned into permanent economic structures. Even church taxes, like tithes, were originally meant for specific purposes: repairs, charity, or funding crusades. Villagers expected to pay for a while, and then it would stop. But many tithes persisted for generations, becoming a standard part of medieval life and influencing modern charitable giving and taxation systems. The medieval tax system was a lot like a leaky boat patched with random pieces of wood. Every time something new was needed, another patch went on. Some patches were temporary, but over time, the patched boat became the standard design. Similarly, temporary taxes stuck, layered upon each other, shaping how society funded itself. So why did these taxes survive so long? Mostly because humans are adaptable. People grumble, complain, try to avoid, and eventually accept. What was inconvenient at first becomes routine. And when rulers change, the easy solution is to keep the tax. The same coins, the same paperwork, the same rules, just quietly continuing year after year. The takeaway is both amusing and a little sobering. Temporary solutions often become permanent if nobody actively stops them. Medieval taxes show that the temporary fix is one of the most reliable ways to leave a mark on history. A short-term need can ripple across centuries, quietly shaping economies, laws, and the way ordinary people live.
Bridges. Simple, practical, and life-saving, right? In the Middle Ages, most bridges weren't built to last hundreds of years. They were thrown together quickly, patched over, and expected to survive just a few seasons of traffic. Peasants, carts, livestock, and sometimes the occasional overloaded wagon. But like so many temporary medieval things, bridges had a way of sticking around far longer than anyone intended, quietly shaping towns, trade routes, and even the landscape. So get cozy, stretch out, and let's cross some medieval rivers. Slowly, because some bridges were more wobbly than your average tightrope. The earliest medieval bridges were simple wooden planks laid across logs. Sometimes they were supported by stone piers, but often they weren't. Most of the time, the builders were improvising. We need to cross this river now. Let's shove some logs together and hope for the best. The bridge was meant to last maybe a few years at most, until someone could build a proper stone bridge. But here's the trick. People started using it immediately, over and over, day after day, year after year. And surprisingly, the bridge survived longer than anyone expected. Temporary bridges often became central points for villages. Once a crossing existed, a path naturally formed leading to it. Traders used it, farmers with carts used it, travelers relied on it, and suddenly you have the beginnings of a town forming around a bridge that was just for now. The bridge didn't just help people cross water, it shaped where people lived, worked, and traded. Some wooden bridges were rebuilt repeatedly. If a flood destroyed a section, villagers patched it. If a log rotted, they replaced it. And over time, some of these quick fixes became more permanent than the people who built them. Eventually, towns decided to invest in stone bridges along the same lines, cementing the original path into history. That first temporary wooden bridge had dictated the town's layout, often for centuries. Take, for example, medieval European towns where the main market streets still follow the line of a bridge built hundreds of years ago. The original wooden structure might be gone, replaced by stone and steel, but the route remains. What was temporary became permanent infrastructure. People might have grumbled about floods, repairs, or wobbly planks at the time, but the bridge left a mark on the map that lasted far longer than any single generation. Temporary bridges also affected trade routes. In medieval times, rivers were obstacles, not highways. Every crossing point was precious. A quick bridge could open up a whole new market or make travel faster between towns. Traders learned which bridges were reliable and built networks of roads around them.
This meant that a single, temporary bridge could influence trade patterns, economy, and even politics. Over time, what was meant to be a small, short-term solution had ripple effects across regions. Sometimes, temporary bridges were deliberately built to last only for military campaigns. Kings or lords needed troops to cross rivers quickly, so armies constructed pontoon bridges, floating wooden structures for a few days or weeks. But when the campaign ended, the bridge often became a local crossing point, and villagers maintained it. Again, temporary became permanent through repeated use and necessity. Another interesting point is that bridges weren't just about utility, they became social hubs. Markets, tolls, and gatherings often centered around bridges. A crossing could include a small chapel, a toll booth, or even a mini market. Over centuries, these temporary wooden structures became community centers. The location, chosen for convenience, dictated how towns developed culturally as well as physically. Floods and storms were a constant problem. Wooden bridges rotted, raging rivers destroyed sections, but medieval people were persistent. They patched, rebuilt, and reinforced as needed. In some cases, bridges survived because replacing them completely was harder than repairing them. This practical stubbornness turned short-term solutions into centuries-old landmarks. Eventually, many temporary bridges were upgraded to stone. These stone structures often retained the original alignment, span, and purpose of the temporary wooden predecessor. Towns built roads leading to the bridge, merchants set up stalls nearby, and houses appeared along the access routes. A single, unplanned, temporary crossing had influenced the layout of towns for generations. Even today, some modern roads and urban layouts still reflect the presence of a medieval bridge. The original crossing dictated street patterns, market squares, and city gates. In a way, the first villagers who slapped logs together hundreds of years ago were urban planners without even knowing it.
Medieval marketplaces were never meant to be permanent. Most of them started as open spaces where villagers and traveling merchants could trade for a few hours, a day, or a special season. Nobody imagined these messy, crowded, and sometimes chaotic gatherings would define the layout of entire towns for centuries. Yet, somehow they did. So get comfortable, tuck in your blanket, and let's wander slowly through a medieval market without getting trampled by a goat or jostled by a cart. Picture a village square. Maybe it's just a patch of dirt near the church or a crossroads. One day, a traveling merchant shows up with sacks of grain, a few chickens, and some cloth from faraway lands. A second merchant follows. Soon, a few villagers set up stalls to sell cheese, eggs, and vegetables. People gather. News spreads. Children run around, dogs bark, someone drops a basket of apples. It's chaotic, noisy, and disorganized. This is not a permanent institution, just a temporary trading hub. But here's where it gets interesting. Once a marketplace starts, people start using it regularly. Merchants return because they know there will be buyers. Villagers come to buy goods they couldn't produce themselves. A path forms leading to the square. Over time, the temporary gathering spot becomes a predictable location. People arrange their homes, barns, and inns around it. Streets emerge. A town begins to form. Some marketplaces were originally tied to seasonal fairs, times when merchants would travel long distances to sell luxury goods, like spices, silk, or metalwork. These fairs lasted a few days or weeks. They were meant to be temporary bursts of economic activity, but the towns loved the traffic, the trade, and the excitement. Slowly, what was temporary became permanent. Villages that hosted seasonal fairs turned into thriving towns with marketplaces running year-round. Marketplaces also shaped city planning. Because trade depended on easy access, roads, alleys, and bridges often led directly to the market square. Over centuries, these routes became the main streets of towns. Even when markets moved, expanded, or modernized, the original square often remained at the center, anchoring the city's layout. Some cities today still have their old market square, right where a temporary medieval gathering first began. Another funny part is tolls and taxes.
Once merchants gathered in a spot regularly, local authorities realized it was easy to collect fees. These charges were often meant to be temporary, just to fund a road repair or guard the town. But as markets continued, these temporary fees became routine. Marketplaces became permanent economic hubs, supported by taxes, tolls, and regulations. Markets weren't just for buying and selling goods, they were social spaces. People exchanged news, gossip, and ideas. Festivals, performances, and religious processions often passed through the market square. The temporary trading hub became the heart of village life. Generations grew up around it, and the original purpose of trading goods became intertwined with community life. Some of the most famous medieval towns grew entirely because of their markets. Bruges, Ghent, and York, for example, all have market centers that trace back to temporary medieval trading days. These towns might look planned today, but centuries ago, everything began with merchants setting up stalls wherever it was convenient. The unplanned nature of early marketplaces gave towns their unique layouts, with winding streets, hidden alleys, and quirky corners that no city planner could replicate. Marketplaces also influenced architecture. Shops, inns, and homes were often built right on the edges of the square. People wanted to be close to the action, easy to sell, easy to watch traffic, easy to join in the gossip. Over time, temporary wooden stalls were replaced by stone buildings. Streets were paved, squares were expanded, and yet the original market remained central. Even today, modern city centers owe a lot to these medieval marketplaces. Pedestrian zones, plazas, squares, and downtown shopping streets often follow the same paths. The temporary idea of a few merchants setting up stalls evolved into permanent urban spaces where commerce and culture mix. The remarkable thing is how temporary intentions created long-lasting impact. Medieval villagers never imagined that their casual gathering spots would define city life for centuries. They just wanted to sell their goods and meet neighbors. Yet these simple actions shaped street layouts, commerce patterns, social life, and even local governance for generations.
In the Middle Ages, religion wasn't just a part of life, it was life. Churches, chapels, monasteries, and shrines popped up all over Europe. But here's the funny part. Many of these buildings were originally meant to be temporary. Maybe a local lord wanted a quick chapel for a wedding, or a village needed a small place for weekly services. Nobody expected these modest structures to last hundreds of years, yet many did, shaping towns, architecture, and spiritual life far beyond their original purpose. So get comfy, relax, and let's wander through medieval religious construction, slowly, without worrying about getting on anyone's bad side. At first, temporary religious buildings were often simple wooden structures. Villagers might carve planks, stack stones, and put together a roof, sometimes barely enough to keep the rain out. The point was not grandeur or permanence. It was shelter for prayers, ceremonies, or community gatherings. Most people assumed that someday a proper stone church would replace it. But here's the twist. Once a building was there, people got attached. A wooden chapel might start hosting weddings, baptisms, and funerals. It became the center of village life. Children were baptized inside, elders prayed inside, and villagers discussed important matters nearby. Even if it was meant to be temporary, it became essential. And when something is essential, it tends to stick around. Over time, temporary wooden chapels were often upgraded. Stone walls replaced timber. Roofs were strengthened. Small shrines became full-fledged churches. Yet, even with these upgrades, the layout often remained the same as the original temporary structure. The original location dictated where the altar would be, where the doors would open, and even where the village streets would run. Monasteries followed a similar pattern. Some were founded with the idea of being short-term centers for pilgrims or monks passing through. A few rooms, a small chapel, and maybe a kitchen. That was the plan. But as monks settled in, the monastery grew. Temporary cells turned into dormitories, small chapels turned into great halls, and suddenly what was meant to be a fleeting religious stopover became a major spiritual and economic hub.
Temporary churches also influenced town planning. Villages often developed around the building because people wanted to live near their place of worship. Markets, homes, and roads formed in relation to these structures. Over centuries, the church became the heart of the town, literally shaping the layout of streets and public spaces. Another interesting example is pilgrimage sites. Sometimes a small shrine or a modest chapel was built to honor a saint, meant to last only as long as the first wave of pilgrims visited. But the miracle stories, donations, and devotion kept the shrine alive. Over time, temporary shrines evolved into large cathedrals. Notre Dame de Paris, for instance, began with earlier, more temporary religious structures on the same site before becoming the iconic cathedral we know today. Even temporary chapels inside castles or manors sometimes lasted for centuries. Lords might build them quickly for personal worship, thinking it's just for me and my family. But these private chapels often became permanent parts of the estate, later used by entire communities and influencing architecture and interior design for generations. The persistence of these temporary religious buildings often had practical reasons, too. Stone was expensive, skilled labor was scarce, and weather could destroy wood quickly. But as soon as a building survived the first few decades, people realized it could last much longer than anyone thought. Rebuilding was costly, so they maintained it, strengthened it, and even expanded it. Some temporary buildings also left cultural legacies. Bells, altars, and stained glass windows were often added gradually, making the temporary space feel increasingly permanent. Over centuries, these structures became symbols of community identity, art, and history, far exceeding their original short-term intentions. And let's not forget the funny little accidents. Sometimes a wooden roof survived because the villagers simply couldn't agree on how to replace it, or a tiny shrine stuck around because it was convenient for nearby villagers. Many of these buildings outlasted kings, wars, and even small kingdoms, all because someone originally thought, this is just for now. The takeaway? Medieval people built religious structures for temporary convenience, devotion, or necessity, but attachment, utility, and practicality transformed these fleeting buildings into permanent landmarks. The same sites that once hosted modest prayers now host tourists, historians, and worshippers alike, all in spaces that medieval builders never imagined would survive so long.
Roads might seem ordinary to us today, just something we drive or walk on. But in the Middle Ages, most roads were muddy, uneven, and often considered temporary solutions. Villagers and travelers didn't expect many of these paths to last for more than a few seasons. They were built out of necessity, connecting markets, villages, castles, or bridges. Yet, like so many other medieval temporary things, these roads survived far longer than anyone imagined, shaping towns, trade routes, and travel patterns for centuries. So get cozy, settle in, and let's slowly stroll down a medieval road. Watch your step. It's a little bumpy. Many roads in medieval Europe were little more than dirt tracks. Farmers used them to bring produce to market, soldiers used them to move quickly during campaigns. Pilgrims trudged along them to reach holy sites. Nobody intended these paths to become permanent. They were just the easiest way to cross fields, forests, and rivers. Yet once people began using them repeatedly, the paths became established. Repetition turned temporary routes into recognizable, semi-permanent roads. Early roads were patched and improved gradually. Villagers might lay down stones in muddy spots or reinforce slopes with logs. The initial goal was simple: make travel easier for now. Over time, as more people used the road, local authorities invested more effort in maintenance. Temporary fixes slowly became permanent infrastructure. Some of the most important medieval roads were trade routes. Merchants needed reliable paths to move goods between towns, ports, and markets. Initially, these routes were little more than informal tracks, sometimes disappearing during bad weather, but repeated use made them crucial, and eventually towns and rulers formalized them. Today, many major highways follow these medieval trade routes.
What started as a temporary path for a few carts ended up guiding travel for centuries. Temporary roads also influenced town development. Villages often grew along well-traveled paths. Inns, markets, and homes sprouted at intersections. Roads dictated the layout of settlements. Some towns even exist today in roughly the same configuration because medieval travelers needed a reliable route to get from place to place. A temporary dirt track became the backbone of a community. One interesting example is pilgrimage routes. Pilgrims needed paths that connected churches, shrines, and holy sites. Initially, these were just trails marked by stones or signs. Nobody thought they would survive for centuries. Yet pilgrims kept using them, communities maintained them, and over time these paths were paved or reinforced. Some pilgrimage routes, like the Camino de Santiago in Spain, trace their origins to medieval temporary paths still used today. Temporary roads weren't always straight either. Medieval builders often had to work around rivers, hills, or forests. The detours seemed temporary, just for convenience. But as settlements grew along these winding roads, the twists and turns became permanent. Modern roads in Europe often follow these same curves, proving that temporary improvisation can leave a lasting mark. Road maintenance was another reason temporary paths lasted. Villagers and local lords were responsible for keeping roads passable. If a bridge washed out or mud made a road impassable, people repaired it using whatever materials were handy: stones, logs, gravel. The patchwork method meant that roads gradually improved over time. What was once temporary became robust enough to survive floods, wars, and centuries of use. Even military roads built for short-term campaigns became permanent by accident. Armies needed quick, reliable paths for soldiers, horses, and supply wagons. After the soldiers left, villagers continued to use these roads for daily travel. Over decades, temporary military tracks evolved into key transport routes. Some medieval roads were also tied to marketplaces. A road that connected a village to a temporary market often became the main trade route. Merchants and peasants relied on it year after year. Soon, houses and shops were built along the way. Roads intended to last a few weeks of market activity ended up shaping the economic heart of towns. The amazing thing about medieval roads is that they show how temporary decisions create permanent patterns. A simple need to get from point A to point B could influence urban planning, trade networks, and cultural connections for centuries. Temporary fixes became essential infrastructure because humans kept using them, improving them, and building around them.
The Middle Ages weren't just about castles, peasants, and muddy roads. They were also a time of cultural exchange. Many interactions between regions, peoples, and religions began as temporary arrangements: a visiting merchant here, a traveling scholar there, or a short-lived treaty between kingdoms. Nobody expected these encounters to last. Yet somehow, many of these temporary cultural bridges became permanent connections, shaping trade, ideas, language, and even cuisine for centuries. So settle in, get cozy, and let's explore how fleeting medieval encounters turned into lasting links between societies. Let's start with trade routes. Long before modern globalization, medieval merchants traveled hundreds of miles to sell goods. Some routes were seasonal, only open when roads were passable or rivers navigable. Merchants met traders from other regions briefly, exchanged goods, languages, and customs, and moved on. These were temporary interactions, but over time, repeated contact established permanent trade networks. Cities like Venice, Bruges, and Constantinople flourished because merchants returned year after year, creating lasting economic and cultural connections. Next, consider temporary alliances and treaties. Medieval kingdoms often formed agreements to address immediate problems, defend against a common enemy, secure borders, or arrange marriages. These treaties were intended to be short-term, but the relationships they built endured.
Dynastic marriages, for example, linked families across nations for generations, spreading culture, art, and knowledge far beyond the original purpose of the alliance. Religious pilgrimages were another type of temporary cultural connection. Pilgrims traveled to holy sites like Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, or Jerusalem. The visits were brief, but pilgrims carried stories, ideas, and practices back to their home regions. These temporary interactions spread artistic styles, architectural techniques, and even recipes. Over centuries, the cumulative effect of countless pilgrimages created lasting cultural bridges between regions. Markets, fairs, and seasonal festivals were also key. Merchants, performers, and artisans often traveled from faraway towns to participate. The gatherings were meant to last only a few days or weeks, but the exchange of ideas and skills didn't disappear when the fair ended. Craftspeople returned home with new techniques, recipes, and decorative styles. Music and storytelling crossed borders. A temporary fair sparked permanent cultural influence. Then there's the spread of language and writing. Latin, of course, dominated religious and scholarly life, but temporary interactions, students studying abroad, clerics visiting monasteries, traders communicating across borders, helped local languages borrow words, phrases, and writing styles. A short-term need for communication gradually shaped vocabulary and literacy across regions. Many modern European languages carry these medieval traces. Even cuisine benefited from temporary cultural exchanges. Spices, grains, and vegetables traveled with merchants, pilgrims, and crusaders. Initially, some ingredients were used for special occasions or temporary feasts. Over time, they became staples of regional diets. Think of cinnamon in European baking or rice in Mediterranean dishes. Medieval temporary imports became permanent favorites. Art and architecture also followed the same pattern. Craftsmen traveling for short-term commissions introduced new styles and techniques. A painter from Italy might decorate a French cathedral for a season. A sculptor might carve a commission in England. These temporary projects inspired local artisans, leading to lasting changes in design, motifs, and craftsmanship across Europe. One of the most fascinating examples is the Crusades. Crusaders traveled to the Holy Land for what was supposed to be a short-term military and religious mission. Along the way, they encountered new cultures, technologies, and trade opportunities. Many of these influences traveled back home. Architecture, navigation techniques, and goods like glassware and sugar became part of European life, permanent legacies from a temporary expedition. Even scholarly and academic exchanges started as brief encounters. Students moved from one monastery or cathedral school to another for a single term. Teachers might visit a school temporarily, but these interactions laid the groundwork for long-lasting universities, intellectual traditions, and the European scholarly network we know today. The key takeaway is that temporary encounters often produce permanent consequences. Medieval people didn't plan for their brief interactions to shape continents, cuisines, or cities, but repeated use, necessity, and curiosity made these cultural bridges endure. Temporary connections became permanent pathways linking peoples and ideas across generations.
Laws in the Middle Ages were often created for very specific, temporary reasons. A bad harvest, a local dispute, a sudden war, or a king's whim could inspire a rule that people were supposed to follow just for now. Nobody imagined many of these temporary laws and customs would survive for centuries, quietly influencing society long after their original purpose had faded. So get comfortable, tuck in, and let's slowly explore how fleeting rules became lasting parts of medieval life and beyond. First, consider sumptuary laws. These were rules about what people could wear, eat, or own, often based on social class. A king might decree, only nobles may wear silk this year, or commoners may not eat swans. These rules were originally meant to reinforce status or fund royal income, and they were intended as temporary measures.
But people adapted to them. Enforcement lingered longer than planned, and the idea of regulating appearance and lifestyle for social order became a standard part of medieval life. The echoes of these rules can still be seen in cultural norms, fashion expectations, and ceremonial traditions today. Temporary laws were often created for harvests or resource management. For example, villagers might be restricted from cutting certain trees or fishing in a specific river during a season to preserve resources. These rules were meant to last only a year or two, but when they proved effective, they often became permanent customs. Over time, these practices influenced broader environmental regulations and communal management of land, the medieval ancestors of modern conservation laws. Then there were curfews. A town might impose a nighttime restriction to prevent looting, fires, or unrest. Originally temporary, curfews persisted in some regions for decades, shaping the rhythm of daily life. People adjusted their habits around these rules, and even when dangers passed, the regulations often remained as part of local custom. Guild regulations are another fascinating example. Medieval tradespeople formed guilds to control quality, prices, and training. Many rules were meant to be temporary, a limit on apprentices, a restriction on production, or a pricing guideline to survive a poor market year. Yet these rules often became standard practices, forming the basis of modern professional standards and trade unions. Temporary economic regulations unexpectedly shaped long-term labor practices. Some temporary customs arose from religious or moral needs. For instance, local leaders might ban certain games, dances, or celebrations during periods of mourning or plague. These were temporary measures intended to maintain public order or piety. Over time, however, some restrictions became integrated into community norms. Even today, we see remnants of these rules in seasonal festivals, holiday restrictions, and public behavior guidelines. Another example is marriage customs. Certain regions enforced temporary rules about dowries, inheritance, or consent to solve immediate disputes. Families followed them for short-term social stability, but many of these customs solidified into permanent legal and social norms. Medieval intentions to manage short-term family issues ended up influencing modern marriage traditions, inheritance laws, and property rights. Temporary tax exemptions or penalties also left long-lasting effects. Kings might grant a one-year tax break to encourage settlement or impose a levy for emergency funding. Some of these policies became permanent after people got used to the system. Long-term economic practices often trace back to these originally short-term fiscal decisions. Even court procedures started as temporary measures. A local lord might create a special trial process to resolve disputes quickly, thinking it was a temporary solution. Over time, certain procedures became standardized, forming the foundation for modern legal practices in Europe. Some customs survived simply because people liked them. A temporary festival rule, a quirky local tradition, or a law about market trading could last because it worked well or became enjoyable. Medieval communities tended to preserve what was practical or pleasant, even if the original reason had disappeared. The fascinating thing is how often these laws and customs outlasted rulers, kingdoms, and crises. What started as a short-term fix often became permanent because people followed it habitually, adapted to it, or simply didn't have a reason to change it. Temporary solutions became cultural norms, social expectations, and legal frameworks.